Welcome to day 26 of Fundamentals of Speech. I'm going to be talking to you about a couple of assignments that you have, and then I'll be talking primarily about methods of persuasion. So, the new information is an assignment that is in D2L under Assessments, Assignments, Day 26 lecture. And what you're going to do is you are going to go in there, read the instructions. I have an example there of the assignment itself that I did myself. And basically what you're going to do is try to find an example of a fallacy of reasoning and then put that in a document and explain what kind of fallacy it is. So you'll identify which fallacy it is and then explain why your sample uh, meets the definition of a fallacy of reasoning. So you're going to look for information in you're going to try to find a fallacy of reasoning in a meme or in a news article or an opinion article or in your Uncle Charlie's post on Facebook or something like that. So you're going to be looking for fallacies of reasoning. If you were in class on Wednesday, you also know that there is a persuasive speech thesis statement survey. You'll go to D2L and assessments and surveys for that. This survey is a Likert scale. It's one of those where you express how much you are in agreement or disagreement with a particular statement. And then there's a bunch of controversial statements in there that you will either agree with or strongly agree with or strongly disagree with or whatever. There's no right or wrong answers, but you filling this out is going to help us develop thesis statements for the next set of speeches. So it's going to help you and it's going to help everybody else in class, and those are due by March 19th at 11 p.m. So that's during spring break. You really don't need to wait for either of these two assignments. Just go ahead and do them. This one I need done before spring break is over so that I can do a little bit of data number crunching with the responses before class starts, so that on the Monday after spring break is over that I have the data to share with you. Okay, so we're going to be talking about methods of persuasion, and basically these are ideas that have been around with us in Western society since the Greeks. I think everybody understands that there's lots of ways to persuade people. You can bribe them, give them money. You can threaten them. You can have a weapon and tell somebody to give you their wallet, and they'll probably do what you're saying. But these are all external persuaders. And the Greeks, who were experimenting with democracy, said to themselves, well, we really need ways to get down on a personal level with people and get them to side with us. You can't really get somebody on your side when you threaten them or use one of these external methods of control and persuasion, because if your money runs out or if you forget to put bullets in your gun, you no longer have any persuasive force, and people will do whatever they want. But if you can convince them that you are right and that they should follow you and they should do the things that you're suggesting, then you don't ever run out of that. Those are semi-permanent changes, and it's important to be able to convince people with internal persuaders. And so basically there's three of them classically. There's building credibility, there's appealing to emotions, and there is using evidence and reasoning. And all three of those are tools of good persuaders and good speakers. So we'll look at ethos first, which is Aristotle's name for credibility, and that is the speaker's believability. It's your opinion about that person and whether or not the things that they're going to say to you are likely to be true, are likely to have your best interests at heart, are likely to meet with your own values, and are things that you're going to accept. So the types of credibility, though, particularly when we're talking about giving speeches, can be broken down into three things. First of all, the initial credibility before the speech, and this is really important to getting people to even listen to you. And if you think about the kinds of messages that you might be getting, we get a lot of messages in advertising, for example. And so if somebody's trying to get me to buy a particular type of athletic shoe, they probably should be an athlete, or they're not going to have very much initial credibility about what it is that I should buy. If it's a beauty product, then the person ought to be a model. They need to have that initial credibility. If I'm trying to learn something about disease prevention, then I probably want to talk to a doctor or to a scientist of some kind. During the speech, you can get credibility, and that's called derived credibility. And it happens when you give a good speech and people listen to you and you seem to make sense, and your reputation rises with them during the speech. And then at the end of the speech, when everything's over, what are we left with? Are we left with this belief that a person is telling us the truth? And if that's true, then we're likely to take that message and move forward with it. Ethos is really important to getting people to listen to you. It's not particularly strong in getting me to change my mind. I can like somebody and not agree with them, but it's absolutely essential in getting people to listen to you to begin with. So we need to know how to enhance credibility. Well, one of the simplest things is just to explain why you are competent. And we've already done that with the competence statement or the credibility statement in your informative speeches. You can also establish common ground. So if during the speech you do and say things in ways that people listening to you say to themselves, that person is a lot like me. They care about the same things I do. They have the same kinds of experiences. They're going to be somebody that's going to make decisions similar to the way I would, and so I'm going to listen to that person because they have the same viewpoint that I do. Finally, you can speak expressively and with conviction because people tend to believe other people who seem to be speaking things from the heart. Now, emotional appeals are the second kind of internal persuader. And these are appeals intended to evoke sadness, anger, happiness, pride, something like that. And the thing about an emotional appeal, if it's done right, it can get people to act very quickly on impulse because emotions are tremendously powerful. And emotional appeals are often used in advertising and particularly in sales pitches, sort of right at the point of sale, because people will make a decision really quickly at that point based on their emotional understanding, and then they'll buy the thing that is being sold, and then later on they may regret it, but they've already bought it. So emotional appeals are really, really powerful in getting people to make decisions right away. If you want to start a riot, use emotional appeals. They don't have a real long last. You have to keep people angry, which is kind of interesting taking current politics into account. A lot of our current politics is based on keeping people mad, and it's exhausting because emotions are exhausting. So recognize that in the long run, emotional appeals fade over time, and it's hard to keep them going, and they don't really, they don't always make us make really good decisions. However, they are important, and you need to know how to use them. Just for your information, Aristotle calls that pathos. And when we're appealing to emotions, first of all, we want to use emotional language, and use vivid language, develop vivid examples. I think we already talked about this when we talked about using statistics. Try to find a way when you are using your evidence to make that evidence as visual, as auditory, and make it to the point where people can almost smell the things that you are telling them, and that will appeal to their emotions. Speak with sincerity, speak with conviction. There's some ethical warnings that should be given when you're doing emotional appeals. If you want to be an ethical person, it's important that you make sure that your emotional appeals are appropriate and appropriate to the topic, because we can just make people mad and then get them to do stuff. But if it doesn't really fit what's being talked about, then that isn't ethical, and eventually it will destroy our reputations. And don't ever substitute emotional appeals for evidence and reasoning. It can be really successful. I think you can look at today's politics and see people acquiring power by using emotional appeals as a substitute for evidence and reasoning. But in the long run, it won't work. You're young. I hope you will live a very, very long life. Don't take the easy way out on stuff. Instead, use logos as well, which is Aristotle's name for logical appeals. And that is based on evidence and reasoning. So let's look at evidence first. Supporting materials used to prove or disprove something is evidence, and we used it in our informational speech. We talked about it in detail. We'll talk about it again, and specifically when we're talking about how to construct a logical argument. We'll talk about logical fallacies later in this lecture, but when we get back from spring break, we're going to talk in great detail about how to put together a good logical argument. Okay, some tips for evidence. Make sure that your evidence is specific. Make sure that try to use novel evidence. In other words, if you have a choice between two different facts and one of them is something that everybody knows and the other is something that builds upon that maybe not a lot of people have heard before, you might be better off using that newer evidence to get the surprise factor. Use credible evidence. Sometimes things that are true are just hard to believe. And if that's the case, see if you can find a piece of evidence that is a little more believable that says sort of the same thing. Because if you get a reputation for saying things that are hard to believe, if you're having a difficult time persuading people, that may be sort of the tipping point that keeps people from following you. And then make sure that you make a really, really clear point with your evidence and that you don't just leave the evidence hanging. And we'll talk about how to do that when we talk about this reasoning process. The reasoning process is when you draw a conclusion based on the evidence. Again, we're going to spend a lot of time on this when we get back from spring break, but very briefly, a good argument has a claim, a warrant, and an impact. A claim is a thing that you say is true, and it's sort of the basis of your argument at the beginning. So I could say something like, it is Thursday. And if that's my claim, then I need to back it up with warrant. So maybe I'm going to pull out a calendar and I'm going to say yesterday was Wednesday and tomorrow is Friday. So I've made my claim. Today is Thursday. Yesterday was Wednesday. Tomorrow is Friday. And then I nail the whole thing down with an impact. And I say, if you can see that yesterday was Wednesday, and you can see that tomorrow will be Friday, and you don't go along with me in saying that today is Thursday, then you are destroying the fabric of time and we can never have a schedule again. Life will be terrible. Okay, we're going to look at specific types of reasoning. There are 4 of them we're going to focus on right now. Reasoning from specific instance, reasoning from principle, causal reasoning, and analogical reasoning. And each of these uses evidence and other forms of reasoning in different patterns, and it kind of depends on what kind of information you have to decide which one is the one that's going to be best for you to use. So we'll start with specific instances. That's moving from particular facts to general conclusions. Maybe you've had another logic course where they talked about inductive and deductive reasoning. Frankly, I am very glad that our book talks about specific instance reasoning and reasoning from principle, because I could never keep inductive and deductive straight in my head. Reasoning from specific instances is obvious what it is. You move from a particular fact to a general conclusion, and it looks like this. My PE course last term was easy. There's a fact. My roommate's PE course was easy. I got another fact. My brother's PE course was easy. A third fact. So now I'm going to go to the general principle that PE courses are easy. Now there's some things to be careful of when we're reasoning from specific instances. We need to avoid hasty generalizations, and we'll talk more about those a little bit later. You might have to qualify the argument in certain cases. You might have to say something like, I realize that we took general PE classes, and that's what I'm talking about. Obviously, if your PE class is varsity football, it's going to be a very different experience. And then you reinforce the argument with statistics and testimony that helps to back up and show that, I have my 3 instances that I have personal experience over, but there's also statistical backup for, my generalization here. Reasoning from principle is basically taking the inverse of reasoning from specific instance. So in this case, we're moving from the general principle to a specific conclusion. And this is a very structured kind of argument that has a major premise, a minor premise, and a conclusion. So it sounds like this. All people are mortal. Socrates is a person, so all people are mortal is the major premise that talks about a general principle. Everybody's going to die. The minor premise is Socrates is an example that fits up here. So my conclusion is, therefore, Socrates is mortal. Socrates will die because all people die, and Socrates is a person. Now, there's some guidelines when we look at reasoning from principle. All of these reasoning structures can lead to bad logic if we're not using them properly. Make sure that you use a major premise that listeners will accept. If I say, all people are nice, Socrates is a person, therefore Socrates is nice, you'll probably get some blowback from the audience. They know some mean people. And then provide evidence for the minor premise. Now, if Socrates is really, really well known, but if I'm talking about someone that we don't know that well, Mickey Mouse or whatever, I probably need then to provide evidence that what I say in the minor premise is in fact true, that Socrates in this case was an actual person. Causal reasoning is establishing relationship between causes and effects. So it's usually pretty good. We know that things happen because of causes, and so if I say because that patch of ice was there, I fell and broke my arm, That seems like a pretty reasonable way of seeing a cause, ice, and then falling on the ice, and then the thing that happens as a result of that is breaking my arm. But we have guidelines here as well. We want to avoid the fallacy of false cause. There was ice there, but actually there was a dog running through the neighborhood that whacked into me right as I was on the ice and caused me to fall down and slip on that ice, and recognize that it really wasn't the ice, it was the out of control animal that caused the problem. And don't assume that events have only one cause. So if I was flat out on the ice when the dog hit me, it's really the two things together that created the problem for me, and it's not just ice. Analogical reasoning is when I compare two similar cases, and analogy is when you're kind of getting out on a limb a little bit. I'm saying that whatever is true for the first case is also true for the second. And the only way that analogical reasoning works is if the two causes are essentially alike. So here's an example of good use of analogical reasoning. If you're good at tennis, you will probably be good at ping pong. I think somebody that was really good at tennis might have an argument with that, or someone who's a really great ping pong player would be able to point out the differences between that and tennis. For the average person, if you can hit a ball with a racket, probably any racket game is going to be something that comes to you relatively easily. But there are fallacies that we have to look out for on all of these kinds of reasonings. There's 11 that we'll talk about. I'll go through the names really quickly. This is what your assignment for this lecture is about. So you're going to pick one of these 11. You're going to find an example of that. You're going to submit that example with your explanation of why it fits a particular fallacy of reasoning, and an explanation of how that works. So, hasty generalization, false cause, invalid analogy, bandwagon, red herring, ad hominem attack, either or, slippery slope, appeal to tradition, appeal to novelty, and whataboutism. Okay, a hasty generalization is jumping to a conclusion based on insufficient evidence. So, here's an example of one. Throughout American history, military leaders have always made excellent presidents. Look at the examples of George Washington, Andrew Jackson, and Dwight Eisenhower. Okay, so those were effective presidents. One might say that Andrew Jackson was a terrible person, but these were all effective presidents. But what about Ulysses S. Grant, who was essentially the one who won the Civil War for the North? He was a terrible president. And what about Abraham Lincoln, who was not a military leader? He was a fantastic president. So this reasoning from examples is not really useful, and it is a hasty generalization. Okay, false cause. That would be mistakenly assuming that because one event follows the other, the first event caused the second. Here's an example. When a team from the NFC wins the Super Bowl, economic growth during the next year is stronger than when a team from the AFC wins the Super Bowl. Therefore, if we want economic growth, we should root for a team from the NFC to win this year's Super Bowl. Clearly those two things are not linked. They are linked in time, but it's a coincidence, and therefore an example of false cause reasoning. An invalid analogy is when two cases being compared are not essentially alike. Employees are just like nails, and just as nails must be hit on the head to get them to work, so must employees. somebody's got a really bad boss. Bandwagon, because something is popular, it's good or correct. The governor must be correct in his approach to social policy. After all, the polls show that 60% of the people support him. Well, 60% of the people like him. That's definitely a true thing. But that has nothing to do with whether or not his social policy is a good one. Red herring. This is when an irrelevant issue diverts attention from the actual subject. How dare my opponents accuse me of political corruption at a time when we are working to improve the quality of life for all people in the United States? Okay, so we aren't supposed to accuse or even consider that a particular political leader might be corrupt because he's working to make America great. Those two things could be true at the same time. We could have a leader who is working hard to improve the quality of life for all people in the United States, who is also a criminal. And to say that the person has our best interests in mind has nothing at all to do with whether or not the person is corrupt. An ad hominem attack, though, is attacking a person rather than dealing with the real issue. Here's an example. The head of the Commerce Commission has a number of interesting economic proposals, but let's not forget that she comes from a very wealthy family. So I guess the implication here is that if somebody's rich, they might have other interests in mind when dealing with the Commerce Commission than the issues that common people might have. But to attack a person because of who they are, where they came from, what they look like, maybe past misdeeds that have nothing to do with the thing that we're talking about right now, all of those things are just bad logic. Let's look at the actual policies that the head of the Commerce Commission is putting forward rather than, who her family was. Either or, a very slippery kind of logical fallacy, because the speaker will try to force a choice between two alternatives when more than two exist. This is also sometimes called a false dichotomy or a false dilemma. We're going to say that there's only two things when really there's probably more. The government must either raise taxes or eliminate services for the poor. And this is actually, those two things are related, right? So it almost sounds like a logical thing to say. We need money to pay for services for the poor, and if the costs of those services are rising, then we might have to raise taxes in order to pay for them. But there might be other kinds of ways for the government to raise money, or there might be other kinds of savings besides eliminating services for the poor. And usually these arguments or these policy decisions are much more complicated than just, one or the other. Slippery slope. That's assuming a first step will lead to a later step that can't be prevented. It's really one that implies that we don't have any courage. We won't say no to a really terrible thing, so let's not do something that's not terrible at all. Now that the TSA is allowed to use full-body scanners and invasive pat-downs before letting us through security, it's only a matter of time before they strip search every man, woman, and child who wants to fly on a plane. So we've all agreed that the pat-downs and the body scanners they're no fun, but they keep us safe, so we're willing to do that. There's no reason to believe that we would be okay with being strip searched, having our children strip searched just to fly a plane. So slippery slope arguments are lousy logic. An appeal to tradition, that's assuming something old is automatically better than the new. An example would be, I don't see any reason to abolish the Electoral College. It's been around since the adoption of the U.S. Constitution in 1787, and we should keep it as long as the United States continues to exist. Well, we have changed lots of laws since 1787. We've even changed the Constitution many times since 1787, and so that's really not a good reason for keeping the Electoral College. The Electoral College might be a good and viable institution still, but let's look at the merits of the Electoral College rather than trying to say that we've had it for a long time, so therefore we can't stop it. The inverse of that particular bad logic is called the appeal to novelty. That's assuming something new is automatically better than something old. Our church should adopt the 2011 New International Version of the Bible because it's 400 years newer than the King James Version. Well, I don't necessarily have an opinion right now on whether the New International Version is good or not, but when it was written is definitely not one of the criteria that I would use in determining whether it was a Bible that I wanted to read. Finally, we come to whataboutism. That is when we deflect criticism from a person or an idea by pointing out the flaws of somebody's opposition. The current favorite argument of political posters is whataboutism, and it's closely related to the red herring fallacy. Whataboutism does nothing to address criticism, but it merely attempts to change the subject, and that's really why it's like red herring. Why are people so upset that Senator Jones kicked a puppy? Where was their outrage when Mayor Smith refused to adopt a homeless cat? So clearly, both things are bad, and it doesn't really matter that we don't need to get into an argument whether it's worse to kick a puppy or to not give a home to a cat that's going to die otherwise or whatever. That's really bad logic to worry about that. If Senator Jones kicked a puppy, there should be consequences. If Mayor Smith should have adopted the homeless cat, maybe there should be consequences as well. It's possible that both of them are wrong at the same time. It doesn't change Senator Jones's culpability. All right, so let's look at that assignment again. You're going to go to assessments, assignments, day 26 lecture, and click on that. Then you're going to read the instructions and look at the example that I posted in there. Then you're going to go online. You're going to try to find a meme or a post or an article or something that has a logical fallacy in it. So it can be a hasty generalization, bandwagon, slippery slope, red herring, false cause, ad hominem, appeal to tradition, invalid analogy, either or, appeal to novelty, or whataboutism. You find one of these, and then you put it in a document and you upload it to that assignment along with your identification. So if you find a slippery slope argument, then you call it a slippery slope argument and you explain why the argument that you found is a logical fallacy called the slippery slope. If it's a red herring, explain why it's a red herring. Right now, the political climate is such that there's lots of really crappy arguments out there on both sides. So, if you want to look at stupid liberals or Neanderthal conservatives, you can find people saying all of these kinds of things. Upload that to the assignment and get that in. It's worth 25 points. I hope to see you at the end of spring break, and on that Monday we will move forward with our information about how to do a persuasive speech. I'll see you then. Bye.